Sunday's municipal runoff elections consolidated the advances of the so-called Big Center in Brazilian politics. This group of mildly conservative, ideologically fluid, and rent-seeking parties won the 2024 elections by any given measure: the number of mayorships won, city council seats, or the size of population they will govern. But another major winner was the Liberal Party, the party of far-right former President Jair Bolsonaro. It obtained the most votes in municipalities with more than 500,000 residents and won the most mayorships among cities with 200,000 voters or more. This week, we will discuss Bolsonaro's effort to transform the Liberal Party into a party firmly under his influence. A bit like what Donald Trump did with the Republican Party in the US, transforming the Republican Party into his MAGA party. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro, editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. This is Explaining Brazil.
If you like Explaining Brazil, you should subscribe to our website, The Brazilian Report, which is the journalistic engine behind this podcast. Or you can go the extra mile and make a donation to our newsroom, tipping our journalists via our Buy Me a Coffee page. And you can also subscribe to our Buy Me a Coffee fan page, pledging a monthly contribution to our newsroom in exchange for exclusive content that you won't find anywhere else. Our Buy Me a Coffee subscribers are Andrei Novoseltsev, Wild Rice, Jaciara de Oliveira, Carson Allen, Gabriel Luca, Pan Ludwig, Leslie Seal, Mark Hillary, Luiz Renz, Erwan Menais, Aaron Berger, Kars Vrieswick, Alistair Townsend, Miller Renarcido, Peter Abramson, David Dixon, Jose Ozi Stankovic, Emerging Market Muser, Anna Lund, Peter Suffren, Anderson da Silva, and someone who chose to remain anonymous. And our Buy Me a Coffee members come from all over the world, so please, if we're butchering the pronunciation of your name, please send us an email. If you too believe in the importance of independent journalism, and if you want to hear your name on our podcast, go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report and subscribe to one of our membership levels. Click on buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report to find out more.
This week, I'm joined by Cláudio Couto, a political science professor at think tank Fundação Getúlio Vargas and host of a podcast called Fora da Política Não Há Salvação, or in English, There is No Salvation Outside of Politics. Cláudio, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Gustavo, for having me.
So, Cláudio, before we delve into the main topic of the episode, I'd like to ask you to assess a little bit the results of the municipal elections. We saw parties from the Big Center score major wins by any given measure, with the left facing some hard losses. What are the main takeaways from this election for you?
Well, firstly, when you consider the Big Center, as you mentioned in the introduction of this conversation, or the parties that I prefer to call adhesion parties, because I believe that these parties can be described as parties that adhere to any kind of government since they have received something in exchange for their support. At the municipal level, not in the congressional level where they are, these adhesion parties, well, they are very pragmatic. And so, despite the fact that we can consider these parties conservative-leaning parties, they are not full conservative parties. They are right to the center. Depending on the situation, they can be even centrist or even left to the center, depending on who is the leader of that party in that specific municipality. And these parties, historically, they are the largest party at the municipal level in Brazil. On average, since 1988, just in the year of the new Brazilian Constitution, these parties have something like 65% of the municipalities throughout the country. This year, they received 71% of the municipalities. They conquered 71% of them. And so a little higher compared to the average of the conquer that they obtained throughout the years, but not so highly. But when we look at the graph and we consider how these parties are developing throughout the years, well, they are increasing their share of the municipalities throughout the country every year. And among those parties, one of them, is notable in its performance in these elections. That is the Social Democratic Party, the PSD, that has its leader, Gilberto Kassab, a former mayor of the city of São Paulo. And Gilberto Kassab is perhaps the most skillful politician in Brazil in what regards organizing a party. And now his party, the PSD, is the party that obtained the largest share of municipalities in the whole country.
And Cláudio, to your point, you're talking about how these parties can shapeshift in terms of ideology depending on the situation. Gilberto Kassab, when he founded his party in 2011, he described it as neither to the right nor to the left nor in the center. So, I mean, epitomizing that chameleon sort of device for them.
Exactly, it's a kind of chameleon party. In that case, it can adapt itself to the environment depending on the situation. This is why the PSD at the state of São Paulo, where Kassab is the secretary of government, is a party that provides support to Tarcísio de Freitas, a Bolsonarista governor, and at the same time, they are participants in the national government with President Lula from the left. And so they have such a kind of situation. In some places of the country, they had coalition for these elections with Bolsonaro. In other places of the country, they had coalitions with the Workers' Party of President Lula. And so they are really very flexible. And they are now the largest party in the country at the municipal level. I don't believe that they will necessarily be the largest party in the Congress in the next election. But, well, it won't be exactly a surprise if it happens.
Now, Cláudio, municipal elections usually follow very different dynamics than general elections. But in every municipal cycle, we see some analysts saying, okay, this will be the time when national issues take over. Now, I personally believe that this phenomenon has never seemed to truly happen, despite many candidates trying hard to make it about national politics. Do you agree with what I just said, or do you think municipal elections are being indeed taken over by broad culture war issues or this Lula versus Bolsonaro dichotomy?
Well, I think that municipal elections in Brazil, they have their own characteristics. They are not exactly a good predictor of what's going to happen in the presidential elections, but they are a very good predictor of what is going to happen at the congressional elections, specifically the elections to the House. And why that? Because, well, mayors and city councilors, they build a kind of a network that provides political support for the candidates for the Congress in the next election, in the upcoming elections, which will always happen 2 years after the municipal elections. And it really works. And they receive something in exchange also, because now, even more, since the Congress obtained a considerable control of the national budget in the recent years, also the congressmen, they provide the municipalities with a bunch of money for the mayors in order for the mayors to make some kind of works or to improve the characteristics of their municipalities. And of course, it can provide a return for those mayors when they run for re-election. And this is why we had a very high rate of re-election this year, something like 82% on average of the mayors that ran for being re-elected. In some cases, in the case of the municipalities that received more money from the Congress, we had something like 95% of a re-election, with the 50 municipalities that received more money from the Congress in terms of budgetary amendments. And so, well, there is a connection between the congressional elections and the municipal elections. There is not a connection in what regards, I repeat, the presidency. In the case of the presidency, the election is very peculiar. People look to the forest, they don't look to the trees, and so it makes a difference. In the case of the members of the Congress, they have a territorial constituency, and then there is an overlapping of their constituencies and the constituencies of mayors and city councilors. And this is why they reinforce themselves reciprocally in this election. But since we have this party becoming stronger, I believe that they will, well, be also a strong party in the race for the Congress in the next few years. This is why I said that it won't be a surprise if they became perhaps the largest party in the House in the next 2 years.
Now, I want to focus on Jair Bolsonaro and his Liberal Party. Some analysts say this election dented Bolsonaro's image both as a political actor and as a kingmaker. For one, because he mainly betrayed most of his allies, but also because his candidates, the purebred Bolsonarista candidates, lost when facing more moderate conservatives in head-to-head contests. But I'm not necessarily sure I agree with that assessment that Bolsonaro comes out of the municipal election smaller than he was before. Because as I said at the beginning of this episode, the Liberal Party made huge leaps in its municipal presence, especially in major urban centers. And Bolsonaro seems to be reshaping the ranks of the party in his image. And I mean, I dare to say that this is probably the first election that Bolsonaro has had as a sort of party man, because he is a party hopper, right? The Liberal Party is the 9th party that he's ever been a part of, and it's the only one where he seems to have some control, because he was always a backbencher, he was always someone on the fringes. But I mean, I believe that the Liberal Party has become the juggernaut it is since 2022, after and because he joined the party. Do you agree with what I'm saying, or do you think I'm off the mark?
Well, I think that Bolsonaro, and not only Bolsonaro, the far right, that comprises not only Bolsonaro and his party, but also the smallest party of the far right, that is the Partido Novo. These guys, they increased a lot their share in municipalities since 2020, 4 years ago. At that moment, they obtained no more than 2% of the votes. Of the cities that they conquered. But now they conquered 10% of the municipalities. And so, wow, it is a considerable increase. Of course, if you say, well, 10% is not too much. Well, it's not too much if you are in a bipartisan system. But considering that Brazil has a very fragmented multi-party system, to have 10% is not insignificant. Just to have an idea, the whole left together with the Workers' Party from President Lula, the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, the Green Party, Environmentalist Network Party, all those guys together have only 15% of the seats. And the far right, that didn't exist almost until 40 years ago, they had now 10% of the seats. Well, they conquered a lot. They ran in many municipalities in the second round of these elections. They didn't win a lot of them, but they ran in many of them. In many of those cases, their candidates are young people that can be important political leaders in the near future. In an important case also, in the city of Rio de Janeiro, they lost in the first round for the incumbent mayor, Paes, that is a mayor that is very well evaluated. It was certain for everyone that he would win those elections, as it really happened. But Bolsonaro's candidate received 30% of the votes. It's not...
And with a very unknown candidate that only got those 30% because of Bolsonaro, right?
Exactly. And so, well, it's not insignificant. Okay, he was defeated in the election, but to be defeated was almost certain, considering the popularity of the incumbent mayor. And in a year when more than 80% of the mayors that were incumbents were reelected. And so, in such a situation, to be defeated there, but to obtain 30% of the votes, well, it's a good score. And this is why I don't think that Bolsonaro is weak. But this is what I can say, considering the electoral results in terms of winning or losing municipalities. But when we consider how Bolsonaro established a political relationship with many political leaders throughout the country, now I think that we have a problem, or at least Bolsonaro has a problem, not us, but here. And why I think that? Well, because Bolsonaro, he fought against some of his allies, his former allies, in many important municipalities in Brazil. It happened in the state of Goiás, a state that is characterized by the dominance of the agribusiness. And in that state, in the elections for the capital, Bolsonaro was defeated by the incumbent governor, Ronaldo Caiado, who used to be a supporter of him. And now they became adversaries, to not say enemies, after these elections. A similar situation happened in the state of Paraná, a very conservative state, in the city of Curitiba, the capital of that state, in which Bolsonaro officially was a supporter of the candidate of the incumbent governor, Ratinho Jr., and his candidate won. But Bolsonaro even appointed the vice and mayoral candidate with the Ratinho Jr. candidates for the city of Curitiba. But eventually, he provided support to the oppositor candidate, a candidate for a small far-right party. What can explain that? He had the candidate of his party as the vice mayor of the state. How can he provide support to the other candidate? Well, because the other candidate was more radical than this candidate that was his official one. And again, Bolsonaro created there a problem, a political problem, and certainly he will face some situations in the future that, well, will make it costly for him. A somewhat similar situation also happened in the city of São Paulo, the largest city of the country, where Bolsonaro had, again, an official candidate that was eventually elected, the incumbent mayor of the city of São Paulo, Ricardo Nunes. He appointed, again, in this case, the vice mayoral candidate, but in the middle of the competition, he started a flirt with another far-right candidate, an outsider that appeared in the middle of the competition, and had the support of many of Bolsonaristas voters in the city of São Paulo. And again, this ambiguous position of Bolsonaro was felt. He just appeared in the very end of the electoral campaign when it was already clear that the mayor would be reelected. Well, he appeared in the moment of receiving the prize, but he didn't appear when the situation was really difficult for this mayor during the race. And again, we had another political, very sensitive situation. And again, we can say that Bolsonaro, during these municipal elections, like is usual with him, he created a lot of political problems, of political trouble, where they weren't really necessary to be created. And this is why I think that despite the fact that finishing these elections as a victorious political leader in terms of electoral results, he can face some political problems in his next steps in the political race, like, for example, in his attempt to obtain an amnesty to recover his electoral rights that he lost due to his role as an authoritarian political leader when he was sitting president. At that moment, he tried to put in doubt the reliability of the Brazilian electoral institutions, even talking to ambassadors of other countries, and this is why he lost his electoral rights. He was trying to recover them, but if he doesn't have support, he won't. And these quarrels with many political leaders will make it even more difficult than it already was to obtain such a goal.
So usually when we go to the runoff stage and we only have two candidates, these candidates usually go more to the center. They try to appeal to a broader electorate and try to be more moderate, at least in their rhetoric. What we saw in this election was the pro-Bolsonaro names in many high-profile races. They actually became more extreme and started hammering harder on those national cultural war issues that, like you said, have limited effect when we're talking about municipal races. Do you think that the underwhelming results that these candidates had against establishment conservatives could force the Bolsonarista candidates to have more moderate rhetoric in future elections, even if it's just lip service?
Well, it's difficult to say because I think that if they become more moderate, they won't be Bolsonaristas anymore. I think that's the problem. To be a Bolsonarista, it is to be a radical. Of course, we have some cases of Bolsonaristas that, declare their support, their loyalty to Bolsonaro every time, like the governor of São Paulo, Tarcísio de Freitas, that try to appear as moderate politicians. But I don't think they caused to Bolsonarista voters in general that deep feeling that made possible for them to vote for a candidate. And this is what the radical ones, they are able to do. And this is why, well, I think that if many of these political leaders that emerged, impulsionated by Bolsonaro's political leadership, perhaps in the future, if they become more moderate, well, I don't believe that they will be more Bolsonaristas anymore. You have even some cases of Bolsonarista supporters that are somewhat, well, can I say, more polite than Bolsonaro himself. But in this case, well, if it is to behave in such a way, why not, I think in terms of the voter, to vote to a traditional politician? What they have as a different thing compared to a traditional politician. I don't think they will have a real appeal to the voters if they behave in a different way. This is why I don't believe in something that some people say that they desire to obtain. There is a kind of moderate Bolsonarista. What I think is an oxymoron. You cannot have that. You cannot have a moderate extremist. And Bolsonarism is an extremist political movement. And this is why I don't believe in such a transformation of this political candidate.
Now, it's interesting because that brings to my next question, which is Bolsonaro is the main reason for the Liberal Party being this electoral force that he has become in recent elections. However, it will not be easy for Bolsonaro to take over the party and control how the party uses its money. Because in Brazil, parties have access to public funds to finance their operations, and these funds are split according to each congressional bench. Now, the Liberal Party's chairman, which is the party's de facto owner, will not relinquish control over this money. And moreover, this chairman, which is a politician called Valdemar Costa Neto, is on the record saying that he wants the party to become more moderate. How do you see these tensions playing out? One guy trying to be more moderate to say that this is the future of his party, but then the ideological reference of the party, Bolsonaro, like you said, being quintessentially an extreme politician.
I think that to me, this desire of Valdemar Costa Neto to make the Liberal Party with Bolsonaro inside it as a moderate party is something like to make the circle a square. I don't think that's possible to be done. And so, well, I think that he must take a decision. Of course, this party, he grew a lot after Bolsonaro's entrance in it, after Bolsonaro's candidacy for presidency. They elected the largest group in the House in the last election. They elected also a good number of senators in the last elections. They even elected some governors in the last elections. And they now increased a lot their share of the municipalities, going up to almost 10% of the municipalities under their control. Well, but to have all of this, that happens because you have Bolsonaro inside the party and this far-right movement inside the party, and there is a demand among the Brazilian voters today for such a kind of political supply. Well, if they try to change the party, I think that we will lose this political appeal. And so it's impossible to make it. I don't believe that they will be able to do that. Of course, if we consider that Valdemar Costa Neto controls party resources and they receive much more money from the public funds now than they used to receive before, well, perhaps he's happy now with that. But he's happy now, but he has to know that it's impossible to have the both things together, to have this money and to have a moderate party. If it is to do that, well, perhaps you have another option. You can be not in the Liberal Party, you could be in the Social Democratic Party of Kassab that tries exactly to do that, to be a more moderate party, a large party, to receive a good bunch of the public funds, but to not be a radical one, do not receive Bolsonaro in it. And this is why perhaps now Bolsonaristas, they choose the Social Democratic Party and its leader, Gilberto Kassab, as their new enemy in political terms. They became their target in terms of political attacks during the municipal election because they realized that this party is occupying a space that, well, they believe that should be occupied by them. But even that kind of calculus is not necessarily correct, since the PSD is growing a lot because they are able to appeal to the moderate voter, to the moderate conservative voter. And they obtain their votes, I mean the Liberal Party, appealing for the radical conservative voter or even to the far right wing voter. And so in this case, it's impossible to have the both things together. I think they are totally incompatible. It doesn't mean that they cannot be allies in some cases. We have seen some electoral coalitions of these parties in some places throughout the country. But it's not that can be combined inside the same political party. And this is why I don't think that it's something that is feasible.
Right. Now, moving on to the left, how do you see the future of Brazil's high-profile left-wing parties shaping up? Because the Workers' Party did perform better than it did in 2016 and 2020, but I think that says more about how those elections were dreadful for the left rather than signaling a major bounce back. And I mean, the party has struggled to connect to an electorate that is increasingly conservative. And one thing was interesting because Guilherme Boulos, who was the left-wing candidate for São Paulo, he issued a manifesto trying to appeal to low-income voters. And one analyst made this observation that I found pretty interesting, is that 22 years ago, Lula launched a manifesto to calm down rich voters by saying, okay, we will not destroy the economy. And now the left is trying to appeal to poor voters, is trying to convince that it has something to offer to poor voters, which can be a little twist someone's brain when seeing that. How do you see the future of the left shaping up?
That's a very nice question. Well, perhaps in some sense, PT is going back to its origins. If you consider the PT in the beginning of the electoral competition in which PT was involved during the 80s and even the 90s of last century, well, they obtained much more votes from the middle classes, the educated middle classes, than from the largest part of poor voters. It started to be transformed during Lula's years in the presidency. And when the PT lost the votes of the middle classes, and they start to receive votes from the poor in Brazil. But something's changing since then. And what I think is changing is what you mentioned, the fact that many voters are becoming more conservative than they used to be in the past. We have this growth of the evangelicals as among the Brazilian population as it's the most growing religious group in Brazil right now. Some people evaluate that they will have something like 50% of the Brazilian population perhaps in the next 10 years. And it's a lot of people. We have to consider that Brazil until very recently was the largest Catholic country in the world. But we have also to consider that, well, it's the largest, or it used to be the largest Catholic country in the world. But Catholics in Brazil, in general, they are not so faithful to their faith as are the evangelicals. And the evangelicals are also much more conservative than the Catholics used to be. And for the left to have a dialogue with such a kind of voter is becoming more and more difficult due to the conservative values that these voters, they possess. And so it's not so easy for the left to convince them that, well, perhaps you could change your mind and vote for the left because actually the left is in favor of you because you are a poor person. Well, people don't care necessarily about this kind of speech right now. They cared before, but not exactly right now. And I think that such a situation is changing. Exactly because, well, there was an improvement of the economic situation of the former poor. Ironically, during Lula's years in the government, and, well, due to the policies that were implemented during Lula's years, but many of these, well, people that became in a better economic situation in recent years, they became also more conservative in terms of morals, in terms of values, in terms of habits. And at the same time, they became also more liberal in terms of their expectations in what regards the role of the state in economy. And for that reason, many of the traditional policies of the left, they are not interesting for this kinds of votes. They prefer a more liberal state. And who offers such a kind of policy alternative for the voters? It's the right. Not only the far right, but also the moderate right. And so the left has a challenge in such a situation because, well, if they tend too much, they won't be the left anymore. They cannot become conservative to convince the conservative voters to obtain their votes. But in such a case, they give up of being a left-wing party or left-wing leaders. It doesn't make sense. But of course, they are trying to find a way to have some points of agreement with these voters, perhaps not being so interventionist in terms of the state, creating some opportunities for these people from the surrounds of the cities, from the poor, to have economic opportunities of investing, of becoming entrepreneurs, because they believe that they are. At the same time, the left is concerned with the precarious situation of labor today due to the transformation of the world of labor in recent years. Workers that, for example, use apps to work, like the Uber, like the people in the motorcycles that deliver food or some other kind of product. Well, these kinds, they believe in many cases that they are a kind of entrepreneurs because, well, they can manage their time. They are not attached to a company in which they have a very strict time schedule to work. And they don't want to be regulated in their labor, as it was the case many years ago when Lula, for example, was a union leader. But it seems that the left is still attached to that concept of the labor and how to regulate it. And this is why I think it's so difficult for them to get in touch with these voters.
No, and it's interesting because the Lula administration proposed regulations for gig workers that would have them be considered formal employees of these tech companies. And actually, the gig workers themselves were against these proposals because of the reasons you just laid out. Now, you mentioned a very challenging environment for the left. You mentioned an empowered center-right and right-wing. How do these results that we have just experienced this past month change or not Lula's administration's strategy and relationship with Congress from now on? Because now we're heading to the final 2 years of Lula in this present term. We have elections for congressional leadership in February. How do you see the municipal electoral results affecting or not affecting how these national dynamics play out?
Well, they can affect in different ways. First, some kind of, for example, renovation of the cabinet of the government. It's very difficult to make such a kind of renovation before the municipal elections. It's normal to wait for them. After the municipal elections, people, well, they are not concerned anymore with making campaign at the state, at the municipal level, and so they can give attention to other kinds of negotiations that will happen in the Congress and between the Congress and the executive branch. This is one of the important points that must be stressed here. The second one has to do exactly with the point that you mentioned. We have the elections for the speakers of the House and the Senate that they will be defined in the beginning of the next year. And this is a very important decision. And we know that the government must be very cautious about that, because if it interferes too much in such elections, it will be considered, an invasion of the competences of the Congress. On the other hand, if they just keep silent, well, it will be considered an omission. And so they have to find a median field in such a situation to know exactly how to behave in such a situation, to not lose the support of the congressional leaders, but at the same time to have, an ally, or at least not an enemy as the Speaker of the House and the Senate. And the government is now experiencing exactly that. And of course, the results of the municipal elections, they affect how the parties make their calculus in what regards all these kinds of negotiations. Since, well, first, they believe that parties that left the municipal elections as strong parties, they will also become strong in next years in the election, in the congressional elections. And so it is already considered in the bargaining process that is happening in the Congress right now. Second, the kind of political relationship that some leaders were able to build, or on the other hand, to destruct during the municipal elections, they will also affect the kind of negotiations that will be made right now. And so they will affect the relationship between the executive branch and the legislature for the next 2 years, and also the composition of the cabinet of the executive branch also. And so, well, what I think is that now we have more time, more space to establish a new moment of the relationship between the two branches of government, considering that in 2 years, Lula can be candidate again. If he is popular in the next 2 years, he will be a very strong candidate, since all incumbents are strong when they run for re-election, and also because we have now, well, a somewhat nice situation in economic terms. We don't know that if it will remain a nice situation for the next years. If it remains, it affects the popularity of the president. Well, many of these parties that are now, well, figuring out what they want to do in the next 2 years, they perhaps will decide to provide support to the government. Even the leader of the PSD, Gilberto Kassab, that, as I mentioned earlier, is a supporter of the Bolsonarista governor of São Paulo, but is also a partner of the federal administration, because his party has ministers in the administration. Well, he will decide what he's going to do. If he's going to provide support to Lula in the next presidential elections, or if he will provide support perhaps for an opposition candidate like the governor of São Paulo, Tarcísio de Freitas. It's very difficult to know what's going to happen. I think that the kind of relationship that was established during these municipal elections will help him to make a decision. Considering his last declarations, it's very likely that, well, he will wait 4 years more to perhaps provide support for Tarcísio de Freitas, the governor of São Paulo, to be a presidential candidate from the right. And perhaps in the next elections, he will prefer or either to be neutral or perhaps to provide support for President Lula. And of course, the fact that he left these elections as a very strong political leader will make it easier for him to establish negotiations with the both sides of the national political competition. And I think that in a different measure, it affects all the other political leaders. And so who left the municipal elections is stronger, will be stronger in the next period of political negotiations, considering not only the composition of Congress, the composition of government, but also the upcoming elections of 2026.
Yeah, we don't know who is going to win in 2026, but we know that they will have Gilberto Kassab as an ally.
Certainly. It's you are totally right.
Cláudio Couto is a political science professor at think tank Fundação Getúlio Vargas in São Paulo, and he's also the host and creator of a podcast called Fora da Política Não Há Salvação, or There's No Salvation Outside of Politics. Cláudio, thank you very much.
Thanks, Gustavo. Thanks for having me.
If you like Explaining Brazil, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. It takes only a second and it helps us reach a broader audience. Or better yet, sign up for the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. Our business model is based on subscriptions, and your memberships fuel our journalism and keep us going and growing. And thanks to our subscribers, we have been able to cover Brazil and Latin America extensively. And for our work, we have won and been shortlisted for multiple international awards. More recently, the World Association of News Publishers, IFRA, considered the Brazilian Report the best news website in the Americas for a small or local newsroom. And we need your support to continue this work. Go to brazilian.report/subscribe. I'm Gustavo Ribeiro. Thanks for listening. Explaining Brazil will be back next week.
you.